Hey everyone, this is Matt with Learn Everything About Design, and in this video we're going to carry on with our wide body, and this is part 14 of the series Scanned Apart. So I didn't want to release this video just yet. I wanted to be done 3D printing all the parts, but unfortunately I keep running into some issues. So what we're going to do is we're going to talk about how to split this up. We're going to talk about some of the features that we might want to add to put them back together afterwards, and just talk about the basic process that you would go through. Now, I will say that I'm not going to go through setting up each of these individual pieces because it does take a good bit of time, and I don't think anybody really wants to go through that on this. I don't think anybody's going to be printing this except for me. I do also want to talk about the fact that at some point in the videos, I did mention that I might just use the 3D print as the fender. That's not going to be the case. I've found that too many different pieces is just not going to be a good solution. However, it is good to glue them together, skim them with body filler, and then build a fiberglass version based off of the 3D print. So that's something to keep in mind, that if you're making smaller pieces, then you can likely get away with 3D printing, especially if it's multiple pieces. Something this big that is essentially structural. I mean, it's not structural in the nature of the car, but it needs to be self-supporting. I don't feel great about having all the different seams on the part. It's just not going to survive, especially talking about two on the front, two on the rear. It's just not going to be a good solution for me for this part. So with all that out of the way, if you want to follow along, you can download the data set in the description of the video. And we're going to get started by first going to the bodies folder, and we're going to turn the full fender into its own component by going to right click and create component from bodies. Now, a couple of reasons that we want to do this. One of the reasons is if you happen to be using Fusion 360 as your slicer, which I did print some of these pieces directly from Fusion, then having them as components is important for the arrange functionality to be able to place multiple pieces on the build platform, but also for things like per body presets in the manufacturing workspace. So those are things that are going to be important. If you are exporting this to a slicer, I've printed the rest of the pieces using the Creality slicer, then having components is really kind of, you can take it or leave it. There are helpful things, especially once we start adding features to each of these parts, to having them as components. So I will talk about that in just a little bit, but keep in mind that the main reason for this is if you're using arrange, they need to be components. And when you're working in the manufacturer workspace for additive manufacturing, components are preferred over bodies if you're trying to build multiple pieces onto the build platform. With that out of the way, I want to talk about two main things, or two main ways that we can split this up. So I'm going to begin by activating this component, and I'm going to talk about using a volume to just keep an intersected portion of the fender, or by splitting it up with sketches. So if we're going to use a volume, what we want to do is go to create and either create a sketch and an extrude, or just use the box primitive. The box primitive will allow us to pick a volume, let's say 250 by 250. Now, in this case, I'm using a Creality Ender 7, which has a build volume of 250 by 250 by 300. That's not the size that I would want to print, and I did try it, and it does cause problems. So I would suggest making it just a little bit smaller than your printer. So what we would do then is we would turn this body into its own component. Now, the main reason for that is because when we right-click and we change the opacity to, say, 20%, nothing happens. Now, if we activate the top level, you can see that the opacity now does change. And the reason for that is because when we activate a component, the opacity of everything else changes, and the opacity of these components needs to be at the top level. So if we right-click and we turn this into its own component, then at the component level, we can change its opacity, and now we can see through it. So at this stage, what I would do is I would move it around. I would potentially use move copy or rotate. So for example, if I select this component, hit M on the keyboard or select move copy, maybe rotate it 90 degrees. So that way the long direction is along the fender. And then I can just simply move it into place. Now what we're looking for here is we're looking to build an overlap between the solid. We can pattern this and we can create the whole grid of these that would allow us to ensure that each piece fits inside the build volume. Now the way that we would turn this into just that piece of the fender is we can either use combine or we can use create and boundary fill. Now I have noticed that there are problems with create and boundary fill. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to select both pieces and I'm going to show you. When we go to select the cells, it doesn't let me select this other cell. Now, for whatever reason, this has been broken in Fusion for just a little bit. If you are using boundary fill and you want to keep that inside piece, what you need to do is hold down the left mouse button, and inside of this sort of phantom menu, it changes which component is being highlighted. So you'll need to select whichever one is highlighted for you to keep. Now, the way that boundary fill works is it lets you use things like solid bodies, surfaces, and planes, and you can combine them all to create a new body. We can cut away, we can keep just the intersection piece. But essentially what we're doing is we're building out just that one piece of the fender. So you can see that it's its own little piece, and we still have the full fender left behind. We also still have the cube left behind, but this gives us one piece to work with. Now, as I mentioned, this is not the way that I would break this up. It's just simply not the most efficient way, and I end up with a lot of extra solid bodies in the design, and I really don't like using boundary fill unless I absolutely have to. So the way that I would break this up is by creating a sketch, and I'm just going to create a couple of sketch lines. So I want to create a vertical line that's taller than the fender, and then a horizontal line that is longer than the fender. I'm going to hit escape to get off my line tool, and then use a pattern. Now for the pattern, we want to make sure that we spread these out using a spacing distribution and based on the size that we want. So 250 is sort of the length or width of my printer. I'm going to do a little bit smaller, 240, increase the number, and then say OK. I'm going to right click and repeat this using this vertical line, begin pulling it back, and again, spacing, I'm going to do 290 instead of 300. And just increase the quantity until I get out of the back of the part. What this allows me to do is use this sketch to split up the solid body. Using the split body tool, I can select the fender, and then I can select the splitting tools I want. I'm going to say OK, right click and repeat. I need to bring my sketch back, but this time I'm going to select the 4 pieces that are left behind, and my splitting tool are going to be these vertical lines, allowing them to extend, and say OK. Now you do need to be careful with this. I've noticed that sometimes it works and sometimes it doesn't. And what I found is that when it doesn't, it fails. It says there's no overlap or intersection. That what you want to actually do is go back and just try to split the body up with one line at a time. See if that works. You might need to potentially move them around. But now that we have all of these extra pieces, what I want to do is I'm going to select all of them, right click, and create components from bodies. Now the main reason that I do this at this stage is because I can now use display component colors, and it'll change the color of each component in this design. This makes it really easy for me to look over here and see the color, see which component it is, and visually I can just tell I've broken this up. I didn't skip anything, I didn't miss any steps. Now, if I was going to be using this file for the 3D prints, I would likely come back and maybe move the lines around, but Fusion's going to be a little picky about that, and I don't really want to break this, so I'm just going to go ahead and move forward with it as is. So what we're going to be doing is potentially we're going to be renaming or renumbering all of these. So for example, this one here, I'm going to call this piece 1. And then moving my way back to the purple one, I would name it piece 2, piece 3, and so on. And renaming these is going to be important, not only at the component level, but at the body level, especially if you're going to be exporting these to another slicer. You would want to make sure that you do know which component is which. So once you've renamed components, it's also extremely helpful to be able to activate them, which again changes the opacity of everything else. We can also right-click and isolate them. Now, again, this is a really nice workflow. It helps us simplify the process of working with each of these pieces of this fender. Now, as I mentioned, I'm not going to go over all of the pieces because the process is the same. It's just time consuming. So what we're going to do is we're going to talk about actually creating some features and the way in which we would want to build this so we could 3D print it. Now, it is important to remember that in this case, the part is sitting on top of the fender. So we can't add any additional features, ribs, or details anywhere it's going to have to sit on the car. So keep that in mind that we don't have a full area to build. We kind of have to work down in this section here. So what I'm going to do, because now it's split up with lines that were going normal to their sketch plane, all of my edges that have been trimmed, this edge here, the bottom edge, and the front edge are all planar, which means that I can just create a sketch right on them. So we're going to right click, create a sketch, double click the mouse to bring it back in view. And from here, I'm going to use offset. I'm going to turn off chain selection and just offset this inside edge and bring it in whatever distance we want for a lip or a flange to connect these together. Now you have to remember the orientation that you're going to build this in, whether or not you want to add things like pins and dowels, or if you just want to simply screw them together with some sort of plastic screw after the fact, or glue them together. What I'm going to be doing is using glue or epoxy to glue them together, and hopefully that will work out okay. If we need to, we can always turn the mesh back on, and you can use slice, which will allow us to slice through the mesh temporarily at that point. And then we can use additional lines. So we want to come out horizontally from here and potentially up here, just come up at an angle that's, kind of matching the fender. And this gives us an area to just extrude. Now what I want to do is I'm going to add another line that's extending out to here. And the reason for that is because now we're able to break these up into those two sections. I don't necessarily want to worry about trimming these back because these are offset lines. They have a constraint between them. If I trim them, I'm going to end up breaking some relationships, and now I no longer have that offset. You don't necessarily have to worry about maintaining the relationship, but if you want to go back at some point and say, make this minus 10 millimeters, having that still there is kind of helpful. And if you trim that, you're going to break that. So again, it just kind of depends on what you want to do. So I'm going to hide the mesh again, and E to extrude, make sure that I select both of these. And the overall fender is 2 millimeters thick, so I'm going to say -2. By default, it's going to want to cut that away. So you can see it's trying to cut it away. If we say join, what's going to end up happening is we're adding a little bit of a lip on top of here. So I want to create this as a new body. And when we create it as a new body, this gives us the opportunity to use split body again. We want to split this little piece, and the splitting tool is going to be the fender. Now, you can also go back and you can use the full fender surface, for example, and that can be a great use of that tool. Down in our component in our bodies folder, we should now see the fender itself. We should see these little pieces, and we should see this piece here. So what I want to do is take this piece and right click and remove it, and then use combine to put these two together. So essentially what we're doing is we're working our way through and adding these pieces together. Now, if you have any problems, like, so for example, if these two pieces didn't join for whatever reason, the probability of the surface being the issue, the trim of the surface or the split body of the surface, is something that you need to go back to, especially since we thickened outward. That means that the inside face here perfectly matches that surface. So if that's the case, what we're going to end up doing, instead of using that surface as our split body, we would just simply use the outside face of our fender. Going to allow it to extend. If we want to add additional faces, it's going to cause a problem. So for right now, because this rolls over, I'm just going to say okay. And if we take a look at the bodies, it did remove some of it, but it left a little piece there. So what we would need to do is repeat the split and then use this outside piece. The other option that we could have is we could offset that surface, that 2 millimeters, to get the outside of the fender. And once we offset the surface, then what we'll be able to do is use it to trim everything away. Now, if I were going to be doing every piece in this fender, that's likely what I would do. So I have a surface that I can use to trim everything, either the entire direction of 2 millimeters or maybe just one, so it's in between. But again, it depends on your geometry and your parts. Now we can join these together, and we shouldn't have an issue. But for whatever reason, it does not like combining those together. Now, if you do have this issue, once again, let's go ahead and let's turn off keep tools. Sometimes that can be causing us problems. And now you can see everything looks good. Let's rotate it around, make sure that we don't have anything up here. And it looks pretty good. So we're going to repeat this process. I'm going to do it on the other side here. Right click, create sketch, double click the mouse, use offset, just the inside edge here. And we went 12 millimeters before, so it's going to be 12 here. Use our line tool, just come out horizontally, show the mesh if we need to, and just sort of bring an edge down where we know we have room, and follow the same process. And this is exactly why I don't want to do this 15 more times, because each part is going to have, let's say, 3 edges, and you're going to have to do this for each of them. So we're just going to do it on this one part so we understand, create a new body just like before. This time, because the design is tapering away, we don't have to use split body to get rid of it. We can just combine them together. Now you could also do the combine at the very end after you make the flanges on the front, back, and side, but it just kind of depends, again, on whatever your workflow is and what your part is. Double click the mouse, L for my line tool, maybe rotate it around just a little bit, and I'm just going to come from this point here to that point there. And once again, because this is tapering up, I should be able just to extrude this and join them together. So if I select join, it should fill everything in. We will have a little bit of a line here. If you are really worried about it, then you need to do a little bit of work to, say, rotate these faces. But honestly, it's not that big of a deal for something like this if we're 3D printing. If we were trying to make a part for tooling, let's say we're going to make a mold, I would not leave it like this. But if we're just doing this to 3D print and we're just going to send it to a slicer, then that's perfectly fine. Now, I will say that if you 3D print this part, you should be aware of the orientation you're going to print it. So for example, I've been printing parts like this. And the reason for that is because I wanted each of the layers to be able to follow the curvature of the part back and forth. If we were to print the part like this, then our layer lines would be different and it wouldn't necessarily follow the contour. So what I would say if you're printing something like this, you have to think about how you're splitting your parts up and how you're printing them. Because if you change the orientation of the parts, if one's getting printed vertically like this and another one is maybe printed like this, the resolution of the way that 3D printer works for those layer lines is likely going to cause an issue for you. So I've been trying to print everything without supports, which obviously is problematic for vertical faces like this. So in some instances, what I've done is I've actually extruded that face down, or I've used things like move copy on the face, and I'll reset the pivot point to, let's say, here, and potentially rotate the face. Now you can see that it's causing me problems. I'm going to reset the pivot point over here. See if we can get it to rotate. So basically, it ends up building a very thick region up here, so you would want to use some sort of infill. But what we can do is we can basically add a taper or an angle there, so that as it's building, we don't need to have support material coming all the way down. Or you can use some custom sort of on-model supports. You can build them up at an angle, just so you have enough to build this top face flat. But if we bring back, let's say, piece 1, we would need to repeat this process for piece 1. One of the benefits here is that you can reuse some of your sketches. So for example, we could reuse that sketch, extrude it forward, and then what we would have to do is we would have to use that split on the outside in order to get it to work. But again, that's the basic process that we would go through in order to split these pieces up in order to 3D print them. What I'm going to do is I'm going to right click and select unisolate, which should bring back the rest of my Fender. And all of these components are underneath the top level component full Fender. So if we activate this, the opacity will go back. And now we're left with all the different pieces of the Fender. Now you can see rotating it around, we would need to build a feature on the top of this one and the sides. And this piece I actually ended up splitting right about here, just because it was much easier to print without this little piece hanging off. So that ended up working out a little bit better. And as I mentioned, these larger pieces up here I've had trouble with. So this piece, this purple piece here, and this yellow piece, I've actually been splitting them in half, making them even smaller. because they seem to print okay until about 5 or 6 inches off the bottom of the build, and then they start to have issues. They start to get knocked a bit, and we have temperature issues being that far away from the build plate and so on. So again, it all depends on your 3D printer and how you're working on these parts. But I've noticed that that's been my biggest issue I've had is sort of these things getting too tall and having issues. This piece here, I ended up printing quite a bit thicker, actually probably about 12 millimeters with 10% infill. So that way I was just able to keep it a bit more rigid and it worked just fine. It's just a lot more material and a lot more time to build, and it ends up being pretty rigid. So at the end of this, if you're following along and you're doing this for your own design, your own Fender, whatever it is, then you have to consider that end goal. Always have to think about that end goal. Are we going to be using this 3D print? Is it going to be just sort of the basis to make sure visually we're on the right track? Are we going to use it to build a mold or a plug out of? All of these things come into play and come into mind. Now, for my scenario here, I mentioned originally I thought I might be keeping the 3D print and it might be okay. I just don't think that's the case, just because there are too many seams and too many pieces. Even with this Ender 7, which is a relatively large 3D printer, it's just not going to be a good solution. Now, if you do have a printer that's big enough to print an entire Fender, that might be a different story. You can get good materials that will work. You then have to worry about deformation of the part over the length of it and what kind of accuracy you need. But for me, probably the best option is to either attach this to the stock Fender and create a fiberglass mold, including all the mounting points of the stock Fender, so that I can replace the entire Fender with this one, or something similar, epoxy this all together, put body filler on the outside, and make it smooth and ready to create a mold off of that can be used as an over Fender. So I haven't really considered which option to go yet. I'm not 100% sold on the design. I need to do the rear as well and spend some time just making sure that I'm happy with the shape and the direction for this car. And ultimately, once I decide that, then I'll determine what the next step is. But as far as this video, I think that's as far as I want to go with the setup because, as I mentioned, it's just very time consuming. I don't expect anybody to go through the process of doing this. I've done it to all of the pieces, and as I mentioned, I've 3D printed most of them up until close to the midway. Mine are broken up a little bit different, but I've got essentially I've got most of this front half done. I just need to get the rear half done and on the car so I can take some pictures of it. So at this point, if you have any questions up to this far, then please let me know. Of course, I've gotten some emails and lots of comments on this. People have really wanted to see the entire process. I do want to mention that there's really not any shortcuts here. This does take a good bit of time, and the quality of the part really comes down to how much time you put in. There are certain things that you can get done quickly, like the basic shape, which we did very early on. We got the basic shape kind of roughed out pretty quick, but the detail work is really where the time comes into play. And I probably could have spent 10 more hours on this before even getting to the 3D printing stage. There are other things that I would want to change about it and potentially go back and do. For example, I probably want to incorporate some sort of lip or spacer that takes up the space between the fender and the car. It fits really well on the bumper here. All that stuff fits pretty well. But the benefit of 3D printing this is that I can reprint these two pieces and have that incorporated without having to redo the whole thing. So it gives me some options. And when I get to the back for these pieces, what I'm likely going to do is split this up so that there is a thin section a couple inches at the very back. And that will let me play around with adding some different features and venting and things like that back there. Just until I'm happy with the overall design and shape. Using that sort of methodology will give me a little bit more flexibility in order to see how those different pieces will play and how I like the shape. And again, with the vent, that was done in a way where I could reprint some of these pieces. Now, I didn't go forward with the vent in this case because it actually would require me to hack the stock Fender up quite a bit to even test if it was going to fit. And unless I'm 100% sold on the design and I end up making an over fender or a complete fender, it's really not worth the effort at this stage. I could always cut this open if I needed to and add that later. But again, it's just kind of the things that we have to think about. Now, something I do want to mention is whether or not the time spent here is going to produce a great result at the very end. Now, obviously, we were able to get the shape relatively quickly. I'd say within an hour or two in forms, we could have something that we could look at and kind of determine whether or not we were happy with the overall shape and design. With that in mind, it is really important that you get a good handle on the shape first before you spend any time on the details. If the basic shape is not right, then the details aren't going to really make the difference. You have to be really happy with that basic shape, and you have to be willing to sort of scrap it and go back to the drawing board if the design calls for that, right? If you get to a position where you're not happy with it or the shape isn't working, you have to make sure that you can take that step back and continue to work with the design. In this case, I do like the way that this looks. It's not that I'm not happy with the shape. I'm just not 100% sure that it's going to work on this car. And so that's what I'm kind of waiting for until I get the 3D print on the car in reality. Then I'll really know if it's going to look right. And it won't really look right until it's lowered a little bit with the right wheels and so on. But overall, this fender is probably quite a bit wider than it needs to be. But that's not necessarily a bad thing. It's just something that I need to see on the car to really help me visualize. So if anybody's out there following this, I'd be interested to know if you are modeling this fender or you're just kind of watching to get some ideas. If you're modeling your own, I'd love to see it. If anybody wants to join the Discord server, you can send me an email, support@caducator.com. I can send you an invite link, or you can just email me screenshots of the stuff you're working on. It'd be really interesting to see what you guys are coming up with and what kind of designs and shapes you're doing. Now, I will say that I have scanned the rest of the car, and I do plan on making the rear fender. I likely won't I'm not going to do a video series on that. I might do just a fast forward 10-minute video on it if I get to it. But yeah, it would be just interesting to see what everybody's doing and coming up with, or what your plans are for using this type of modeling approach. I do plan on doing one more video. I know I'm kind of rambling on at the end of this video, but I do plan on doing one more video in the series. That one will be when I have all the 3D prints done and on the car. I don't really think there's any more to cover on this. We've done 14 videos, which is probably 12 too many on this subject, but we've got the scan data and we processed it, and we then have been working the last 11 videos on modeling this fender and breaking it up. So I think that's probably quite a bit of information, and I do think that maybe at the very end I'll try to do a recap or something that's included when I show the 3D prints. But if there's anything else that you think I missed or that you want to see, please let me know. As always, thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.